The call came at 7 in the morning, while I was still in my robe, standing at the kitchen window watching the first light move across the lake. I had my coffee in one hand and the quiet in the other, the way I liked it. My son's name lit up on the screen and I smiled, thinking maybe he wanted to come up for the weekend. Maybe bring the grandkids I kept asking about. Dad. His voice was clipped, the way it got when he was about to ask for money. I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen and not make it a whole thing. I set the coffee mug down on the counter. Good morning to you too, Kyle. The cabin. A pause. I sold it. I didn't speak. The deal closed yesterday. The buyer is a development group out of Chicago. They want to break ground on a resort complex before winter, so they need the property vacant. I'm going to need you to be out by Friday. Friday. It was Tuesday. Kyle, I said slowly. What did you just say? I said I sold it, Dad. We needed the money. Melissa and I have been drowning for 2 years and you know that. The property was sitting in my name doing nothing except costing us property taxes. The market was right. We got a good number. 3.2 million. It was the right call. I turned away from the window. My eyes moved across the living room. The mounted walleye, my father caught in 1971. The stone fireplace Eleanor and I built with our own hands, the summer after we were married. The bookshelf where 40 years of memories sat pressed between hardcovers. It's in your name, I said carefully. But Kyle, this is my home. Technically it's mine, Dad. You signed the transfer 12 years ago. You wanted to avoid probate. Remember? Your idea. He was right that I had signed something. He was wrong about what it meant. But I didn't say that yet. I just stood there in the kitchen, while the morning light moved across the water outside, and something very cold settled into my chest. The development group, I said. Who are they? Lakefront Holdings. Out of Chicago. I already told Melissa's parents we're using the money to move to Florida. We have a fresh start waiting for us. You can find something nice. There are good retirement communities down in. I hung up. I stood there for a long time. I walked to the window again and looked at the water. This was 40 acres of northern Minnesota lakeshore. Eleanor had grown up 2 miles from here. We spent 30 summers in this place. My granddaughter took her first steps on that dock. I buried Eleanor's ashes in the garden behind the old pine tree, and every morning I said good morning to her on my way to get the paper. Kyle had sold it in a phone call. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I sat down in the leather chair by the fire. The same chair where I'd spent 15 years reading depositions, drafting arguments, building the kind of legal reputation that made other attorneys nervous when they saw my name on the opposing counsel line. I had retired at 62 because Eleanor got sick and I wanted to be with her. I had let people forget who I was. I had let my son forget what I had spent 40 years doing for a living. That was my mistake. I took a slow breath. Then I reached for the phone and called the one number I hadn't dialed in 4 years. Frank picked up on the second ring. Walt. His voice was warm, familiar. You calling to finally take me up on that fishing trip? Not today, Frank. I paused. I need you to pull up a deed for me. Northern Lake County. Parcel 11408A. Registered to Kyle David Harmon. A brief silence. The sound of a chair rolling across hardwood. What are we looking for? I need you to find the life estate notation in the encumbrances. It should be in the secondary recording, filed separately from the main transfer deed. I filed it myself 12 years ago, and I want to confirm it's still there. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear Frank breathing. The sound of a computer waking up. Walt, he said finally. What did your son do? He sold the property. Frank. The silence that followed was the silence of a man understanding the full shape of a situation. Without checking the title, he is not a careful man. And the buyer? Lakefront Holdings, Chicago. They paid $3.2 million. Cash wire. Probably already cleared. Frank let out a breath. Walt, if the life estate is recorded and the buyer didn't find it, then they bought a property they cannot develop, I said. Because the life estate grants me the legal right to occupy this land until the day I die. Any structure, any improvement, any so-called resort complex, it all sits on a parcel burdened by my occupancy rights. They cannot break ground. They cannot bulldoze. They cannot build a single fence post without my consent. And Kyle, represented the title as clean. He did. That's fraud, Walt. Yes, I said. It is. Frank went quiet again. Then he said, very softly, you knew they might try something like this. I looked out at the lake. A heron was standing on the end of the dock, still as a fence post. Eleanor always said herons were good luck. I had my suspicions, I said. A man doesn't spend 40 years in real estate law without learning to protect what matters. I just hoped I was wrong about my son. I wasn't wrong, but I wasn't finished either. I need you to understand something about Kyle before I explain what happened next. My son was not an evil man. He was a weak one, which is sometimes worse. He had his mother's warmth and his own inability to say no to anything that promised a shortcut. 2 years ago, he and his wife Melissa had poured $400,000 into a restaurant group with 3 locations in Minneapolis. The restaurants were Melissa's dream. The math was Kyle's problem. Within 18 months, 2 locations had closed. The third was on life support. They had borrowed against everything they owned. And when that ran out, they borrowed against everything they thought they owned. I knew this because I had been quietly paying attention. A father always is, even when his children assume he has gone soft. I spent the first afternoon after Kyle's call making 2 phone calls. The first was to Frank, which I've described. The second was to a man named Dennis Wall, who had done investigative work for my firm for 22 years and who had the uncanny ability to find the financial skeleton in any closet given 48 hours and a modest retainer. I drove to meet Dennis at a diner off the county highway, 40 minutes from the cabin. I wore my old canvas jacket and a baseball cap. I didn't look like a man with 40 years of courtroom experience. I looked like a retired grandfather, which is exactly what I wanted. Dennis was already in the back booth when I arrived, a manila folder open on the table beside his coffee. He was a compact man with a gray beard and the permanent expression of someone who has stopped being surprised by human behavior. I started running preliminary numbers on Kyle and Melissa Harmon the moment you called, he said, not bothering with a greeting. You were right to be concerned. He turned the folder toward me. The picture was not pretty. The restaurant group collapse had left a debt trail of just over $900,000. Credit cards, a business line of credit, 2 personal loans from online lenders charging interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. But the part that made my stomach tighten was buried on page 3. Kyle owed money to a private individual listed in the paperwork under a shell company called Westside Venture Partners, LLC, in the amount of $420,000. The loan had been taken out 14 months ago. The interest rate was not listed. The collateral was not specified. Westside Venture Partners, I said. Do we know who is behind it? Dennis tapped the page. A man named Garrett Pruitt. He runs a private lending operation out of a commercial building in South Minneapolis. He is not affiliated with any bank, any regulated institution, or any entity that reports to a state licensing board. He has 2 civil judgments against him in the last 5 years. He also has a reputation for being very persuasive when payments are late. I set the paper down. I thought about my son. I thought about the desperate arithmetic of a man who had borrowed money from people like Garrett Pruitt. He wasn't just selling the cabin to pay off debts, I said. He was selling it to stay safe, Dennis said. The Pruitt loan has a due date of November 15th. That's 3 weeks away. I looked out the diner window at the gray October sky. 3 weeks. That was why there had been no conversation, no discussion, no attempt to involve me in the decision. There hadn't been time. They needed the money now, and the fastest way to get it was to sell an asset they believed was cleanly theirs. The word believed was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. I want you to keep monitoring the outflow from their account, I said. I want to know the moment that wire transfer starts moving. Dennis nodded. And if the money goes to Pruitt first? Then my son is no longer in physical danger, I said, which means I can focus entirely on the legal reality. I drove back to the cabin as the sun went down over the lake. I sat by the fire with Frank's confirmation document in my lap. He had pulled the county records himself and scanned them to my phone. The life estate notation was exactly where I had placed it, buried in the secondary encumbrance index, cross-referenced to the parcel ID, but easy to miss if you were doing a standard title search, focused only on the main deed chain. Lakefront Holdings had not done a deep search. They had paid a title company for a basic report, seen Kyle's clean transfer deed from 12 years ago, verified there were no outstanding mortgages, and considered themselves done. They had paid $3.2 million for a piece of property that I had the legal right to occupy until the day I died. They did not know that yet. I looked at the fire. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the morning she told me she was sick, sitting in this same room, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her voice so steady it broke my heart. I thought about the last 2 years I'd spent here alone, learning the shape of a house without her in it, deciding to stay anyway because this was the place we had built. My son had sold it to strangers. He had sold it so he could move to Florida with Melissa and start fresh, leaving me somewhere behind them like a piece of furniture that hadn't made the final cut. I picked up my phone. I called Kyle. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice careful. "Dad, I wanted to let you know I'm not going to make a scene," I said. "I understand you had your reasons. I'll start going through my things." A pause. Relief. Bleeding. Into his voice. "Dad, I'm really glad you're being mature about this. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know you love that place, but it's just a building. You know? You can make new memories somewhere else." "Of course," I said. "Just a building." Melissa and I are actually coming up Thursday to do a final walkthrough with the development company. They want to walk the property before they finalize the demolition schedule. I hope that's okay. "That's perfectly fine," I said. "I'll be here." He sounded relieved enough that he said goodnight almost warmly. I set the phone down and looked at the fire for a long time. Thursday. That gave me 48 hours. It was more than enough. The next morning, I drove to Frank's office in Duluth. He had a conference table cleared, and the full title chain spread out across it like a map of a battle I had planned in advance. "The life estate recording is airtight," Frank said. He had the precise, measured delivery of a man who spent his career choosing words the way surgeons choose instruments. It was filed properly, cross-indexed, and it predates the transfer deed itself. That means it attaches to the property regardless of subsequent ownership. Kyle could not convey clear title because he never had clear title. "And Lakefront Holdings," Frank exhaled. "They are going to be furious. They paid $3.2 million for a property they cannot develop without your consent. Their entire project timeline is built around breaking ground before the ground freezes. That window closes in about 6 weeks. If they can't develop this season, they lose their financing commitments. Their permits go stale, and their whole business model for this acquisition falls apart." "Good." Frank looked at me over his glasses. "Walt, they are going to sue Kyle." "Yes. They are going to argue fraudulent misrepresentation, that he sold them a property with a material encumbrance he failed to disclose." "That is correct, because that is what happened." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Is Kyle aware of the life estate?" I considered this carefully. I believe he knew I had structured the original transfer to protect my right to remain on the property. Whether he remembered the specific legal mechanism 12 years later, or whether he chose to ignore it, I cannot say. But he had a responsibility to order a complete title report before representing that property as unencumbered. He did not do that. "That is not my negligence. That is his." Frank nodded slowly. "What do you want to happen on Thursday?" "I want to be at the cabin when Kyle and the lakefront people arrive," I said. "I want you there too. I want the county sheriff there as a witness, and I want to be wearing my suit." Frank allowed himself the smallest smile. "The gray one?" "The charcoal," I said. I spent Wednesday in the cabin. I sorted a few things, not because I was leaving, but because the act of touching every object in the house made me remember why I was staying. I held Eleanor's gardening gloves. I ran my hand along the spine of the family photo albums on the shelf. I stood on the dock in the cold October air and looked out at the lake for a long time. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was Dennis. The wire had cleared at 4 in the afternoon. $3.2 million had landed in Kyle and Melissa's joint account. Within 2 hours, $240,000 had gone to a creditor in Minneapolis. An hour after that, $430,000 had been wired to Westside Venture Partners LLC. Garrett Pruitt had his money. Kyle's knees were safe. By 9 that evening, Another $150,000 had gone to a property management company in Fort Lauderdale, a deposit and first month on a waterfront rental in Florida. They were celebrating. They were already gone in their minds. I sat by the fire that night with a glass of bourbon and the document Frank had prepared, a formal notice of life estate interest, notarized and ready to be delivered. I looked at the fire and I thought about all the years I had spent being a father instead of a lawyer. I had been patient. I had been generous. I had transferred this property in good faith because I wanted Kyle to have a future. I had given him money. When the restaurant struggled, I had never once held any of it over his head. I had believed that generosity would teach him gratitude. I was wrong. Generosity without accountability teaches nothing except entitlement. The fire burned down to coals. I went to bed. I was up at 5 Thursday morning. I made coffee and stood at the window and watched the lake come alive in the gray dawn. I dressed carefully. The charcoal suit I had worn to argue before the state appellate court in 2009. A white shirt, no tie. My cufflinks were a pair Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary, plain silver, engraved with the date. Frank arrived at 7:15. He was carrying his briefcase and wearing the expression of a man prepared for battle. "Sheriff Anderson will be here at 8, Frank said. "He owes me a favor from the Kessler estate case." Good. We had coffee together in the kitchen, talking about nothing consequential, the way old colleagues do when they are waiting. At 8, Sheriff Anderson arrived in a county cruiser. He was a broad, quiet man who had spent 23 years in this county and who understood that some situations required a uniform and a witness and nothing else. At 8:25, 2 vehicles turned off the county road and down my gravel driveway. The first was Kyle's leased SUV. The second was a black company truck with the Lakefront Holdings logo on the door. 3 men, in construction jackets, climbed out of the truck. Kyle and Melissa climbed out of the SUV. Kyle was wearing the kind of casual confidence that comes from believing a difficult chapter is already behind you. Melissa was in new boots and a wool coat that probably cost more than my first car payment. They were talking and laughing with the developer, a square-jawed man named Dorset, who had the handshake of someone accustomed to closing deals. And for a moment, watching through the kitchen window, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. Then I thought about the phone call Monday morning. I stepped outside. The effect was immediate. Kyle stopped walking mid-sentence. The confidence flickered when he saw the suit. It flickered harder when he saw Frank beside me in his own suit with his briefcase. It went out entirely when he saw the sheriff's cruiser. "Dad!" His voice had lost its certainty. What's going on? Why are you dressed like that? Why is there a sheriff here?" I walked toward them at an easy pace. I looked at Dorset. "I assume you're the project lead from Lakefront Holdings." Dorset looked from me to Kyle, confused. "That's right. And you are?" "My name is Walter Harmon," I said. "I'm a retired real estate attorney. I'm also the holder of the recorded life estate interest on this property. I thought we should meet before your team wasted any more time talking about demolition schedules." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realize the ground has shifted. Dorset turned to Kyle slowly. "What life estate?" Kyle's face had gone gray. "Dad, there's no. You transferred the property 12 years ago. It was a clean transfer. I have the deed." "You have one of the deeds," I said. Frank stepped forward and handed the development team the certified copy of the encumbrance recording. Dorset took it, scanning the first page. His expression went from confusion to something harder. "The life estate was recorded 1 day before the transfer deed," Frank explained, with the quiet precision of a man who had done this 100 times. "Under Minnesota property law, it attaches in priority to any subsequent conveyance. Mr. Harmon holds the legal right of occupancy on this parcel for the duration of his natural life. He cannot be removed, and no development activity may be conducted without his explicit written consent." Dorset looked up from the document. He looked at Kyle. The warmth was entirely gone from his face. "You represented this property as unencumbered," Dorset said. Kyle's mouth opened and closed. I didn't know. Dad never told me about." "You had a legal obligation to order a complete title search," Frank said. "A standard search focused on the primary deed chain would miss a secondary encumbrance filing. A comprehensive search would not. You chose the faster, cheaper option because you needed the transaction to close quickly. Melissa grabbed Kyle's arm. Kyle, call our attorney. Your attorney is going to tell you the same thing my attorney is telling you, I said, not unkindly. You sold a property you could not legally sell free and clear. Mr. Dorsett paid $3.2 million for a parcel that cannot be developed without my cooperation. The transaction was either negligent misrepresentation or fraud. In either case, it is actionable. Dorsett was on his phone before I finished speaking. I heard him say the words title defect and legal exposure, and get someone on the line right now. Kyle turned to me. For the first time since Monday morning, he looked at me the way he used to when he was a boy. Not with contempt. Not with the impatience of a younger generation brushing past the older one. With fear, and under the fear, with something that was almost shame. Dad, he said, please. I waited. I know I messed up. I know this looks bad. But you can fix it. You know that. He took a step toward me, his voice dropping. You just sign a waiver. You waive the life estate interest. The title clears. The deal stands. Lakefront keeps the property. We keep the money. Everybody's fine. Please, Dad, just sign the paper. Melissa moved closer, her voice tightly controlled. Walter, I know we didn't handle this well. We should have talked to you first. But you have to understand the pressure we were under. The debts, the restaurant. We were terrified. We made a desperate choice, and we know it was wrong. But you can make this right. You have that power. Please don't punish us for one mistake. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked past them at the lake, at the dock, at the old pine tree behind the garden, where Eleanor's ashes were scattered. One mistake, I said. They nodded. Not calling me, I said. Not discussing it. Not giving me the courtesy of a conversation before selling the place where your mother's ashes are buried. Kyle flinched. You told me it was just a building, I said. You told me I could make new memories somewhere else. You had already decided what my life was worth. You made that calculation without me. I paused. What you're asking me to do right now is to absorb all of the consequences of your decision so that you feel none of them. That is not mercy. That is you asking me to take a fall a second time. Dorsett came off his phone. His demeanor had shifted into something businesslike and cold. He walked directly to Kyle. Our legal team confirms the encumbrance, he said flatly. The sale is voidable. We are initiating a clawback of the wire transfer, effective immediately. Your bank will receive a legal hold notice within the hour. Anything you've already disbursed is your personal liability. We will be pursuing full recovery through civil litigation. And depending on what the title company's E&O carrier decides, there may be a referral to the county attorney's office for fraud. Melissa made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Kyle looked like the ground had opened under him. The restaurants, Melissa said, almost to herself. We paid Garrett, we paid all of it, the Florida deposit. Then you have a problem, Dorsett said, without sympathy. I watched Kyle turn to me one more time. His eyes were wet. He was my son, standing in the driveway of the home where he had learned to fish and to ride a bike and to read, and he was asking me to save him from himself. Dad, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. I know I was wrong. I know I was selfish. I was scared, and I didn't think. I'm asking you to forgive me. Not because I deserve it, because you're my father. I had been waiting for that word. Forgiveness. I thought about what forgiveness actually means. Not the kind that comes from avoiding consequences. Not the version that says the debt is cleared and everything goes back to normal. The kind that requires the person asking for it to stand in the full weight of what they did and still be standing when it's over. I forgive you, Kyle, I said. I mean that, he exhaled. His shoulders dropped. But forgiveness isn't a transaction, I said. It doesn't come with a waiver attached. You need to face what you did. Not because I want you to suffer, because you will spend the rest of your life making the same choices if you don't understand the cost of this one. I looked at Sheriff Anderson. He gave a small nod. I turned back to my son. I'm not going to press criminal charges. I told Frank that before you arrived. But I am not going to sign a waiver. The life estate stands. The transaction remains defective. Lakefront Holdings will pursue whatever remedy they choose, and you will answer for it. That is not punishment. That is consequence. Kyle sat down on the steps of the front porch. He sat down like a man whose legs had stopped working. Melissa stood beside him with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the lake. Dorset and his team were already walking the property line, talking in low, urgent voices. The black truck idled in the driveway. The demolition that was supposed to begin within the week would not begin at all. Frank came to stand beside me. He was quiet for a moment. "What happens to them now?" he asked. "They'll answer a civil suit," I said. "They'll work through it. Kyle is not stupid. He is reckless, but he's not stupid. He'll find a way to settle." I paused. "He'll have to sell the SUV. Probably defer the Florida move. Get a real job, maybe, instead of chasing the next shortcut. You think he'll learn?" I looked at my son, sitting on the steps of my porch. He was staring at the gravel. Melissa had sat down beside him. They weren't talking. They were just sitting in the wreckage of a plan they had thought was brilliant 3 days ago. "I think having to work their way out of this might be the best thing that ever happened to them," I said. "Provided they do the work." I walked back into the house. I went to the kitchen and made 2 more cups of coffee. Then I carried them outside and set one down on the step beside Kyle. He looked up at me. "Drink your coffee," I said. He stared at it. Then he picked it up with both hands. I sat down in the wooden chair by the door and looked at the lake. The heron was back on the end of the dock, still and patient as a principal. It took a long time before any of us spoke. The lakefront truck had left. Frank and the sheriff had said their goodbyes. It was just the 3 of us, in the quiet of a Thursday morning in October, the cold coming off the water, the sky, the color of a pewter plate. "I didn't know about your mother," Kyle said finally. His voice was low. "About the pine tree. I know you didn't." "I would have." He stopped. "I don't know what I would have done. I want to say I would have done something different. I want to believe that. Then be the person who would have," I said. He looked at me. "How?" "Start with what's in front of you," I said. "You owe Lakefront Holdings. Work out a payment plan. Sell what you have to sell. Take the smaller apartment. Eat out less. Do the boring, unglamorous work of cleaning up a mess that you made. And when you get to the other side of it, you will know something about yourself that you don't know right now." "What's that?" "That you can survive the fall," I said. "Most people never test it. They spend their whole lives avoiding the fall. And that fear of falling is what makes men do what you did. The moment you know you can hit the ground and get back up, it stops being so terrifying." Melissa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was the first genuine, unguarded thing I had seen from her in years. Kyle set his empty mug down on the step. He looked at the pine tree behind the garden. "Can I go over there?" he asked. "To Mom's tree?" "Of course you can," I said. "This is still your family's land." He stood up and walked across the lawn, slow and deliberate, his hands in his pockets. Melissa followed him. I watched them stand together under the old pine, not saying anything, just standing. I went inside and stood by the kitchen window. The coffee was warm in my hands. The lake was still, the way it gets in October when the summer boats are gone and it's just the birds and the wind. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the afternoon we filed the life estate paperwork. The 2 of us sitting in my office with Frank, and Eleanor asking me if I really thought it was necessary. I'd told her I hoped I was wrong. She had squeezed my hand and said she hoped so too. I had spent 12 years hoping I was wrong about my son. I was not wrong. But standing at the window watching him stand under his mother's tree in the gray October light, I thought that maybe wrong was not the only thing a man could be. Maybe the distance between where Kyle was standing and who he was capable of becoming was exactly the width of the lesson he had just been handed. I had given him every advantage his whole life, every shortcut I could clear, every consequence I could soften, and I had produced a man who called his father's home just a building when the bill came due. What I had not given him, until now, was accountability. That was the one thing a father could not buy, borrow, or transfer to his children through estate planning. That was the one thing that had to be earned the hard way. The only way. I set the coffee mug in the sink. I walked to the back door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. I walked across the lawn to the garden, to the old pine tree, and I stood near my son and my daughter-in-law without saying anything. After a while, Kyle looked at me. "I'm going to fix it," he said. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix it." I nodded. "I know you are." We stood together for a little while longer, the three of us, under Eleanor's tree, with the lake behind us, and the cold sky above us, and the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that still had to happen, sitting quietly among us like a fourth presence. I was still standing in my own home. My son was still my son. The rest was just work. If you've ever had to let someone you love face consequences you could have prevented, you know exactly what this feels like. Some of the hardest moments in a parent's life are not the ones where you cannot help your children. They are the ones where you can, and you choose not to, because you know that helping them now would only hurt them later. I spent 40 years as a lawyer protecting people from consequences that were not their fault. Protecting my son from consequences that were entirely his own would have been the cruelest thing I ever did to him. Sometimes the most powerful thing a parent can do is step aside and let the weight of the world do the teaching that love alone never could. If that speaks to something in your own life, leave a comment and tell me about it. I read every single one. And if you believe that real strength sometimes means holding the line, even when it costs you something, hit that like button and subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. I'll be back next week with another story.